What's going on, everyone? Bran here from Bloody Breakdown, and today we're going to be taking a look at the possibility, the actual real possibility, believe it or not, of a 28 months or maybe even 28 years later. So we got two big pieces of information, two totally separate articles published in the exact same day about something, yeah, of course, we've heard a lot about it over the years. The anticipated sequel to 28 Days and Weeks Later, the incredibly well-made zombie flicks. I guess you could call them zombie flicks, the Rage Virus, that came out a number of years ago. I think the original 20 years ago this year, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even a little bit longer. But you know, it's one of those things. We've waited on a supposed 28 months later for over a decade now at this point. We finally are starting to see some glimmers of hope, some glimmers of light that might actually be finally coming to fruition and out of, I suppose, developmental hell, as the term goes. So anyway, this first article we're going to be taking a look at, as you can see here, titled 28 Months Later or 28 Years Later, Danny Boyle and Alex Garland are having serious talks about the long-awaited sequel. And if you don't know, Danny Boyle directed the film, Alex Garland wrote the film. And yeah, originally this thing was supposed to be titled 28 Months Later, but as I mentioned earlier, you know, we're 2 decades in at this point. We probably could go with 28 years later based on how some of the actors will have aged at this point. So let's dig in here to the article, because I absolutely love 28 Days Later. 28 Weeks Later is a pretty decent film, but 28 Days Later is a very, very well-made film, and I would love to see more of these. So the article says, fans of 28 Days Later and its follow-up 28 Weeks Later have been waiting 16 years. Jesus Christ, I was right. It's almost been 20 years. Waiting 16 years for another entry in the franchise, hoping we'd someday see a movie called 28 Months Later. Back in 2009, we heard Paul Andrew Williams was on board to direct the film, but that didn't go anywhere. Yeah, we've seen a couple of those, to be perfectly honest. A couple of instances where it looked like we may actually be finally seeing some traction on this thing. It goes on to say, since then, every once in a while, we hear 28 Days Later director Danny Boyle and screenwriter Alex Garland mention 28 Months Later, say there was a great idea for a script, and then later say it might never happen. In an interview last year, Boyle said Garland had already written the script, and this might be the time to make the movie. Now the collaborators have confirmed to Inverse that they are having serious talks about the sequel, which may turn out to be called 28 Years Later, which, you know, guess makes sense at this point. Garland said, quote, a few years ago, an idea materialized in my head for what would be really 28 years later. Danny always liked the idea. Boyle added, so we're talking about it quite seriously, quite diligently. If he doesn't want to direct it himself, I'll be well up for it if we can execute a similarly good idea. And then it goes, kind of goes on to talk about 28 Weeks Later wasn't as successful. I'd like to argue I think it was very successful. Sure, it wasn't as successful. Says making $65.8 million on a budget of $15 million. Yeah, I'd say it's still pretty damn successful. Definitely not to the level of the original, which it actually says here 28 Days Later, $84.6 million on an $8 million budget. That's part of the reason why another sequel hasn't happened sooner, along with the fact that Garland wasn't overly pleased with 28 Weeks Later, which he didn't write. Garland told Inverse, I resisted making a sequel for a long time because there were things about 28 Weeks that bugged me. I just thought, fuck that. I'd rather try to write a different story in a different world. And I guess I could understand that frustration, having your IP, I guess, a world you built, created, you know, someone comes in and kind of tinkers with it, I could see how that would definitely mess with you. And another thing, saying that we didn't get a sequel because the movie cost 15 mil and made 65 mil. It's like, wow, what a world it was back then. I mean, now you have movies being made for, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars and being completely and totally embarrassed at the box office. And you still might get another sequel. And, you know, it just kind of goes in from there. So basically, essentially, this article is saying that Alex Garland may or may not already have a script together for this thing. There are some serious talks about Danny Boyle returning to direct, but there's a missing element, and we get to talk about that missing element in the next article. So like I said, the same exact day we get this update as well. 20 years later, Cillian Murphy is on board if Danny Boyle and Alex Garland are. So if that last article, if the contents of that article come to fruition, our star is on board as well of the original 28 Days Later. And now, given that this guy's just been in Oppenheimer, I mean, he's a much bigger star now at this point, and he's still down to do this thing. Commendable. It really is. It shows that he really has a lot of love for that source material, that he really has a lot of love for the crew involved, and it's good to see. So here they say yesterday, which, as far as I can tell, these things were published on the exact same day. Yesterday, we shared the news that 28 Days Later director Danny Boyle and screenwriter Alex Garland say they have been having serious talks about finally making a sequel that would be called 28 Years Later. And in an interview with Collider, 28 Days Later star Cillian Murphy has said that he'd gladly be in the sequel if it's made by Boyle and Garland. So Murphy, who is currently doing the press rounds for Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, where he plays the title character, had this to say about a 28 Days Later sequel. Quote, "I was talking to Danny Boyle recently, and I said, Danny, we shot that movie at the end of the 2000s, so I think we're definitely approaching the 28 years later. But like I've always said, I'm up for it. I'd love to do it. If Alex Garland thinks there's a script in it, and Danny wants to do it, I'd love to do it." And then it just kind of goes on to talk about, you know, a little bit more insight on the original film that he was in. But wow, holy shit. I mean, in a, we'll just say in a 24-hour period, we have news on the original director, the original writer, the original star, all in some shape, way, form, or fashion, ready, willing, and able to come back to finally give us the trilogy that we've deserved here in this 28 days, weeks, what we thought was months, but at this point seems more likely to be years later. Oh man, I'm excited. Like I said, the original is such an interesting film, such a cool take on the zombie genre, or subgenre, I guess, to be more specific. And I would absolutely love to see this thing finally come to fruition. So what do you all think? Leave your comments down below. What do you think about a 28 months or even more specifically 28 years later happening? Do you think we're finally gonna get this thing out of developmental hell and have it go down? It seems to be a little bit more positive news than generally I've ever heard before over the years, so I'm pretty optimistic about it. And as always, folks, do the YouTube stuff. Leave a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and hell, even while you're down there, check out the description. A couple of links to follow me on social media, support the channel if that's something you would be interested in doing. So, with that said, I'm Bran, and this has been your Bloody Breakdown on a possible 28 years later.